Hello, everybody. It was so interesting, the presentation that we've been attending before a minute finished. So it was actually very interesting for an hour. Thank you, Mara, for your very, very interesting presentation and how we can work with dialogues and so on. It was very interesting, actually. Now I would like to ask Ryan Hamilton from Canada to explain us developing inclusive and interactive learning strategies in first and second year university courses. Is again another very interesting presentation and discuss about the way we assess our students' performance and measure their successes. So we expect to hear more from you. The floor is yours. We will leave 1 or 2 minutes until Ryan Hamilton will join us and start sharing the slides. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for attending this talk on developing inclusive and interactive learning strategies. I just wanted to open with a little bit of information about myself and my background. My name is Ryan Hamilton. I'm an instructor and learning and development professional. My educational background includes an MBA in organizational leadership. My career actually started working in accounting, so I'm a certified management accountant, and currently I'm a doctoral candidate in educational leadership. So I'm very passionate about lifelong learning, and specifically in the past couple of years, I've been teaching primarily first and second year students. So that's kind of the context for my research. I've worked at 5 different post-secondary institutions, and I find that there is a gap in this area at each institution. So really the main purpose of my discussion and my paper and my research is to try and get a conversation started on how we can take a step forward in developing these inclusive and interactive learning strategies. I find that it's easy to say, you know, we want to develop these strategies, but how are we actually going to put a foot forward to get there? So that's kind of the intention behind why I'm doing what I'm doing. So on the agenda for my presentation includes a little introduction to the topic, followed by a problem statement with my literature review and the framework that I followed. Then I'll discuss some of the methodologies, opportunities that I find that institutions might be able to focus on, followed by some evaluation considerations when you're considering inclusive and interactive learning, followed by some concluding points on some suggestions on what you might want to implement at your own institution or wherever you might be using this information. So some information to get started. Creating interactive and collaborative classrooms in post-secondary environments have been effective in improving student failure rates, retention, and learning skills for all students. And really, when we begin looking at ways to create classroom environments that are inclusive and interactive, we are opening the door to so many more students who would otherwise not have the support they need. So that's really my main purpose of this research and this topic is I found that there's a lot of students who aren't aware of what post-secondary education is like when they're going into it. So that shift from secondary to post-secondary learning is quite daunting and overwhelming for a lot of students. I wouldn't say the majority, but a good portion of students really do struggle when they move, from grade 12 to post-secondary studies. So there's a lot of things that we can be doing that we might not necessarily be doing, whether that's resource constraints or anything like that. But there are some small things that we can be doing on a day-to-day basis to make improvements for students. So I want to start by defining some key principles, and starting by mentioning that academically, students transitioning to first year university or college studies struggle with the course workload and are not sufficiently prepared for the independence that they're given. So students are entering in a completely new environment, and sometimes I don't think that as instructors, we may take that into consideration. A lot of these students, they might be 17, 18 years old. They're moving out for the first time from their families. There's a lot of things that they now have to take care of on top of scheduling their academic studies. And of course, these are all responsibilities that they have to take on when they become, an adult and they leave home. But I think that a lot of the students aren't prepared or don't understand what this independence means for them. So that's where we come into play with inclusive and interactive learning strategies. And starting by defining inclusive classrooms, it refers to an environment where all students feel supported intellectually and academically, and are extended a sense of belonging in the classroom, regardless of identity, learning preferences, or educational background. And when we're looking at interactive learning strategies, this can be summarized as a technique that seeks to get students actively engaged in the learning process, often through the use of technology. And I did want to highlight that the paper that I wrote on this research is significantly longer than what I can include in the presentation. So this kind of just scratches the surface of the things that we can be doing. And there's a lot more behind the scenes that I've covered outside this presentation, but this is kind of just to give you a little flavor for what I'm suggesting we could be doing. And really, the problem that I'm trying to achieve, or what I'm trying to look into, is identifying and implementing inclusive and interactive learning strategies as a whole. So the focal point is on identifying and implementing ways that students can become engaged in their own learning. And like I mentioned, the transition from secondary to post-secondary education also poses a challenge for many learners. So how can we achieve this? What can we be doing differently? And a lot of this presentation is going to be focusing on universal design for learning principles, also known as UDL. Now, to take a step back and look at some of the literature that I assessed when I was going through this topic to understand what are potentially some of the underlying problems, not just from the student's perspective, but from the institution or like at the program level, what are the things that are the most challenging for students? So I just want to start by noting that an inclusive education system teaches students the benefits of diversity, cooperation, and consideration of others, whereas separate programs create barriers to opportunities for children to learn from, support, and develop relationships with one another. So one of the reasons that I mentioned on the right side of the slide here that the minimum education required to be a lecturer is typically a master's degree, the reason that I mention this is because I found at each institution that I've worked at, and I've worked at 5 different post-secondary institutions, there's not necessarily formal discussions that are had around creating an inclusive environment. And I find that, whether you're at the lecturer level, an adjunct professor, assistant professor, associate professor, at least from my experience, I went through a bachelor's degree program, a master's degree program, and I'm doing a doctorate right now. And I've never taken a class in those programs that taught me how to be an effective teacher. You're qualified to teach at the post-secondary level when you have a master's degree because you're considered to be a subject matter expert in the topic itself, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to effectively lead a classroom, or you don't know how to be inclusive of all different types of learner styles. And this isn't the fault of the instructor themselves. I know for myself, I wanted to learn how to be a more effective teacher, so I went on to complete a master's certificate in adult learning and learning design. So that's what I did to try and gain some of those skill sets. But when you're perhaps an adjunct professor teaching an evening class, your daytime job is going to be a priority. And when you're teaching at night, you might be doing that on the side just to, teach, make some extra money, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have the time to learn or be capable of implementing all of these different inclusive learning environments. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that barrier that some institutions might have depending on the employees that they employ in their programs. It doesn't necessarily mean that they might have the capacity to do so. So there are some limitations with this research, as well as noting that completion rates are low based on levels of enrollment. So through my research, I found that less than a quarter of students enrolled at public 2-year institutions complete their programs within 3 years. And at 4-year institutions, only 58% of students who enroll at public institutions and 69% of students who enroll at private institutions actually complete their programs at any institution within 6 years. And I think that while that number maybe perhaps seems high for public institution, for the private institution, 58% for a public institution might seem rather low. And a lot of these reasons are, contributing from things such as financial burdens for students to continue their studies, but a lot of it can have to do with the environment that the student's learning in. They might not understand the expectations of what a student in post-secondary needs to be doing, or they might not have the tools available to them to be a successful learner. Typically in a classroom, you might have, a lecturer at the front of the room just talking off PowerPoint slides for an hour, kind of like what I'm doing for this 30 minutes. But you have that every single class for an entire term. Now, a lot of students, and again, I don't want to say the majority, are not going to be able to retain information that way. So that's where we're trying to implement further inclusive learning techniques, and where we're looking at universal design for learning principles to try and get us from, point A to B, so that we're going to be, instead of including let's say 50% of the learners in a classroom, how can we accommodate up to 75, 80% of learners so that we're doing everything that we possibly can to be as respectful of the different learner types that we have. As well, I also wanted to note that much of the research in this paper and presentation stems from a North American context where I've taken my education and where I've taught, but the principles and applications are relatively universal around the globe, I would say. A lot of the inclusive practices that we might follow, whether that be light and dark themes in a learning management system, offering videos instead of just textual assignments for students to complete. Those are all things that we can be doing in different areas of the world. Of course, there's going to be cultural differences, but again, this is going to be a North American context primarily. And when I consider some of the literature for this topic, one of the most important theories that I consider that's relevant to inclusive and interactive learning is the student development theory. So this theory suggests that college students' developmental stage affects how they think about and experience the world, and it can shed light on their needs and help higher education administrators to improve their ability to support students through their college journeys. So really what this theory is saying is that students develop their thoughts and their ways of knowing and being throughout the development stages that they're going through. And specifically with these first and second year students, they're entering an entirely different part of their own world. You know, they're not living at home anymore. They might be living independently. They're taking completely different classes than what they're used to. But this can also shed light on their needs and what higher education administrators need to focus on to be able to include a lot of different learner types. And this theory overall is grouped into 5 characteristics, being psychosocial, cognitive structural, person environment, humanistic existential, and student development process models. And these are important psychological concepts to understand within universal design for learning theories and the application of inclusive and interactive strategies in the classroom, as really truly there's a lot more at play to consider around the development of a student's way of thinking and their internal knowledge center. It's more than just the knowledge that they bring from their secondary studies, but it's where they were raised. You know, what sort of home environment did they have? What are their different types of learner needs, and what accommodations might they need? Now, Neff-Clamp and Wittick later developed instructional models that best fit the student development theory and include structure, diversity, experiential learning, and personalism, which from my experience teaching in the past 6 years, these are concepts that are a little bit more familiar to institutions now, especially with trying to create diverse classrooms, diverse learning styles, and a big emphasis on experiential learning. And this model is highly correlated with design principles of learning strategies that engage learners and ensure that learners are developing study skills, retention of information, and are taking part in experiences that benefit their learning outside of a traditional classroom. Now, when I'm considering some of the frameworks that I went through to complete my research, primarily my research was conducted through abductive reasoning, and I found that as every institution approaches their instruction differently, there is no one-size-fits-all answer. So a lot of the conclusions that I come to in my research, a lot of the things that I might be mentioning, it's not going to work for every institution in different style. You might be a 2-year college, a 4-year degree program. You might have master's, PhD, or maybe you're a polytechnic institution. This isn't going to work across the board, but a lot of these are things that individual instructors can implement within their own instructional style and their delivery methods. And inclusive learning and education looks at the system as the issue, whereas integrated learning views the student as the problem. Now, I mention this because when we're looking at inclusive learning, it's not necessarily, we might be quick to judge the student and say that, you know, their specific background is the reason why they might be more challenged to learn in a specific way. But when we're looking at implementing further inclusive learning strategies, we might look at it as the system as a whole and look at, you know, that program delivery method might not be working for this business program such as accounting, or you might have a marketing elective that might be better delivered in a work integrated learning context. And so these inclusive learning principles are looking at the system as a whole, as opposed to just pinpointing the student as the issue. And a great deal of this includes making the best assumption based on the information and the resources available. Again, this is going to change significantly from institution to institution. And just a little bit more information to highlight on the UDL principles. There's 9 principles in total with 31 checkpoints. And the focus of this research is focused on 3 principles that make up its vision, which include multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. Now, when we're looking at inclusive and interactive learning strategy models, we need to understand that learners need to be made aware of the usefulness of a new technology to gain that buy-in. And I mention this because students have limited capacity, especially when students are in their first year, they're taking electives from multiple different faculties or different schools within an institution. So those instructors obviously aren't going to be talking to one another to let them know, I'm going to be implementing this new technology in my class. So if a student's taking 5 classes, 4 out of 5 of them might have a new technology that they have to learn for that specific class, and that can be extremely overwhelming for the student. So you need to be able to be mindful of how often and how much are you changing your content and material to be aware and cognizant of the limitations that students have. And when we're specifically looking at interactive learning, the technology acceptance model, also known as TAM, states that successful integration will be based on acceptance by users in 2 ways. The first way is perceived usefulness, and the second way is the ease of use. And really, students need to be aware of and understand the perceived usefulness, of why is this technology enhancement useful for the delivery of this class, and how easy is it going to be for the student to use. If they need to go on a weekend kind of deep dive on the internet to understand how this specific program might work, that might not be the most ease of use software for a student. And other key variables may include sociological, demographic, and economic impacts. So really overall, students have limited use for new technology models, especially if they might have a full course load. And then when we're looking at inclusive assessments, Saunders and Cardia of the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching from the University of Michigan points educators' attention to inclusive learning that not only encourages the ability for all learners to have an opportunity to participate in, but also by making course content presented inclusive. And I get into a couple more examples of that in the next couple of slides. So when I'm looking at implementing new learning strategies, there's 3 kind of key areas that I consider, at least in my own implementations, and that includes considering immersive experiences, assessing the implementation, and then focusing on inclusivity. So when we start with immersive experiences, we're looking at this being the control to create personal narratives, access manageable pieces of material, and adapt dynamic scaffolding according to individual schema. And this is paramount to interactive learning strategies. So really it's understanding in a classroom, you might have a very diverse group of learners where, let's say there's a level 1 to 5 of the knowledge of the students in the class. The majority of your students might be at a level 2, but a lot of your students might be at a level 4 or 5 already in that subject matter, whether they're taking that course to fulfill a degree or if they're doing it to upskill. You need to understand that there's a lot of different learners in the classroom, and you need to scaffold those learning outcomes and the learning steps when you're delivering the content so that you can cater to a lot of those individual students. And in the context of assessing implementation, there's 4 key areas that you look at: the learners being the who of the learning process, the content being the what of the learning process, pedagogy is the how of the learning process, and context is the when and where of the learning process. And focusing on the inclusivity, as educators, we need to identify our own personal biases, intentional or not. As much as we don't want to, think a certain way about a particular student, sometimes it just happens based on our own lived experience. So we just have to try and minimize that as much as possible. And there's also several assumptions that are made about certain learner groups, which are not necessarily substantiated by evidence. And they're important to raise awareness of, whether they might come from a different socio-economical group. We need to be mindful of the biases that we have ourselves to make sure that we're creating an inclusive environment for all learners, not just the ones that we might favor more than others. And as well, looking at creating inclusive content, you might be able to customize the display of information, whether that's light or dark themes on an LMS. Again, these are really small changes that you can make that can have a really big impact on students. And I find that in classes that I've taken and other instructors that I've had delivered, a lot of these things can be overlooked, but really it could be a very small change that makes a really big difference. You might be looking at clarifying complex vocabulary words by including a glossary in a class, or symbols and providing illustrations through multiple media methods. And this is really important for learners. You might have learners who prefer to record a video presentation as opposed to doing a written assignment. As long as you're meeting those learning objectives and you're getting those learning steps in, I think that there shouldn't be any issue with that. Of course, you want to be able to test the writing skills of a student, but if you have the opportunity to modify an assessment for a student and they're still going to be reaching this same learning outcomes at the end of the day, being open to those new opportunities, I think, is really important as educators. And that's kind of some of the points that I'm trying to hit home here. And when we're starting looking at evaluation practice considerations, you might want to look at potentially implementing inclusive learning technologies such as mural boards. And I found in my own classroom study that I completed last year, this increased the classroom interaction by 24%. You also perhaps want to understand that limitations exist, whether it is time or the resources available to make change. So of course, not all of these things are going to be able to be implemented in a timely manner. This might take several years. And UDL principles that align with engagement include developing self-assessments and reflection opportunities for learners and encourage collaboration among students. And going a little bit deeper into some of these evaluation practice considerations, when we're talking about inclusive education models, you might want to look at the Index for Inclusion. And this is a 3-dimension index that includes producing inclusive policies, evolving inclusive practices, and creating inclusive cultures. So it's kind of a reflective assessment that you might want to go through as an institution or a business, whatever you might be, to go through these steps. Looking at interactive technologies, categories of evaluation of technology can include functionality, accessibility, technical aspects, privacy, data protection and rights, social presence, collaboration efforts, user accountability, and teaching presence. And when we kind of look at a more informal context of inclusive education, really you want to have it needs to be accessible in an easy to access format that can be used with inclusive learners who may also require voice to text or text to voice accommodations, on-screen keyboards, etc. Interactive technologies, any new classroom educational implementations need to be at a level that students can grasp without enhanced or secondary training. And you'll want to avoid complex softwares or operating systems that are not commonly used. So typically, if your institution focuses specifically on Windows-based operating systems, it might not be a great idea to try and implement something that works on Mac solely, because then those students are really going to have to find ways that they can access that software. So being mindful of those small details can really go a long way for creating successful students. Now, some of my concluding remarks, these are just some suggestions that I found that have been successful. Designing classroom discussions and assessments around universal design for learning principles. You might want to include diversity statements in course syllabi or on learning management systems at the beginning of a course or term, so you can kind of set the tone from the start. And it's always helpful as instructors and educators to familiarize oneself with inclusive education policies at post-secondary institutions. These are constantly evolving, so it can be sometimes difficult to keep up to date with it. But of course, whenever you have the time to look at some of that information to see what resources and supports are available for instructors and students, you can better accommodate the needs of your students. As well, you might want to consider implementing interactive tools such as mural boards or other gamification products to enhance learner participation in the classroom, whether that's virtual or otherwise. And overall, you want to ensure that evaluation practices and considerations are being accounted for. So the process is not really a one and done solution at all. It's an iterative process that requires assessment, identifying tools that work, and then where improvements can be made over time. This, again, isn't going to be something that you'll be able to change overnight. It can take many years. You might have to create a strategic plan for your institution or department to implement some of these things. But these are all goals that you might want to try and achieve and strive for in the coming years.
Thank you, Ryan, for your all the presentations.
Thank you. I open the floor to any questions if anybody has any.
Do you also have any questions? You can come in like easily too.
Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
Oh, you can hear me clearly. Good.
Mhm.
All right. Are there any other examples of gamification methods that you would recommend or that you could suggest?
I would say that it kind of depends on the context of the materials that you're delivering. But I would say that tools like Kahoot are quite popular, at least in my institution. I think that that's a really good way to engage learners in their content. And it creates fun competition. But again, it kind of depends on the context that you are delivering the content. So in like a business marketing class that I might deliver, for example, that might work where you have Kahoot examples. But in a nursing course, that might not work the same way. So that's just one example. I would say that is a good way to include some gamification.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we have another one question. Could we?
Oh, yes. Hi, Ryan. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question regarding what you mentioned, having your own blind spots in recognizing different groups within the whole group. Yeah. How do you approach this? You said for several years, of course, but somehow you need to start. So how can myself as a lecturer, how can I find out about my blind spots being maybe non-inclusive in some situations?
That's a really good question. I think one of the ways that I approach it in my class is I use exit tickets a lot as a form of formative assessment in my classroom. So gaining kind of an understanding or knowledge of what your students' backgrounds are is a really good place to start. Without doing an assessment like that, you might not necessarily know where your students come from, what maybe affects them outside of the classroom. So I think that's a really good place to start to understand what types of learners you have. And then you can take steps to, maybe include different diversity statements in your course syllabi or course outlines. That's what we use. For example, where I teach right now, we're on treaty territory. So we include that we're on Treaty 4 and 6, and that kind of creates an environment where a lot of our Indigenous students might feel a lot more welcomed. And without, the institution sometimes letting us know of these sorts of things that are available, I might not necessarily know as a lecturer. But I think just raising awareness and understanding what are the backgrounds of your students and surveying in kind of a very low stakes environment through an exit ticket could be a good way to start.
Okay, thank you.
I would also recommend, if anybody hasn't taken the implicit association test, Harvard offers, it's just a free test that you can take. And that gives you kind of a breakdown of different biases that you might be displaying. And also the Wheel of Identities is a really great activity you can do with students it's anonymous, so you can just have them fill it out. So you can get a better sense of all the different identities that your students identify with. So.
What's the name of the test?
Implicit association test by Harvard.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Ren.
Thank you.